Hello. In this episode of Airs for Architecture, Ed Parham, Director of Design and Innovation at Space Syntax, talks about their work on city making, the Space Syntax methodology, and the possibilities of data-driven architecture and design.
Underneath it, there's a built environment, and that makes a behaviour possible or not. And that's what these people are complaining about in the stories that are making it into the mainstream press, that they live somewhere that's completely car dependent. The really important thing is that we can be really precise about explaining the characteristics of the built environment that make it car dependent or not. So then the next way of thinking it through is that if you can start to see that there's a set of spatial characteristics that affect daily activities and longer term outcomes, then the question is really about how it's almost what you do with that spatial intelligence.
Airs for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Ed Parham. Ed, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks, Ambrose. I'm an architect. I work for a company called Space Syntax. I've worked there for 15 years, and hopefully I'll be able to talk about some of the issues that we've kind of encountered through that time.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, that's a very short introduction. No frills. And you're based in London, and Space Syntax's work is based.
Well, yeah, I can expand on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, why don't we? Why don't So, what's your? I guess what I'm interested in here is the way that you come to be in Space Syntax. But perhaps if we understand what Space Syntax is first, then your journey into it as an architect becomes slightly more. It's an unusual pathway because it's an unusual practice, a mode of spatial design.
So the Space Syntax is a set of techniques for consistently describing and analysing relationships between space. And that can mean internal spaces in buildings, but it can also mean spaces in a bigger scale. So across a city, across a town, even a region. And Space Syntax has a particular approach, which is about modeling and analyzing these networks of space. And the purpose of this is so that you can start to consistently understand the sorts of things that designers affect. So the spatial relationships. The purpose of Space Syntax is to better understand how you can shape those relationships and how they relate to daily activities and long-term outcomes. So some of the background to Space Syntax was that it was started at University College London, started in the Bartlett, and it was partly a response to a lot of design that was meant to be cutting edge that happened post-war, but which wasn't working the way that people expected. And it was difficult for people to explain why it didn't work. People had different ideas around whether it was that people don't like living in buildings if they're made of a certain material, or they don't like living in a certain building if it has a particular spatial form, of a pitched roof or a flat roof or things like this. And Bill Hillier, who was the professor there at the time, started to really question this and ask in a much more critical way, is there a scientific way of being able to link the design of these places to what's actually happening? And the story that I've heard, which I don't know if it's completely true, but the story I heard was that he was visiting a lot of places to try and see them, understand what was happening. And the same thing kept happening. And that was that when he walked around the corner of a building, he would bump into somebody face to face, and neither person would know the other was around the corner. And so Bill started to think there's something about the way that you can see through space, the way that spaces fit together, and the way that you move through them. And so what he started to do was actually to map these spatial networks, so all the places that you could actually see through and walk through, to translate that into a graph and to analyze that graph. And so that would mean turning every space into, without being too technical, turning every space into a node in a graph. This kind of analysis gets used a lot now for things like social network analysis, to see how many people you're connected to and how many steps away you are from everybody. And Bill was really using this to look at how well connected spaces were. And so there was a whole series of things that came out of that research. which was around things like better connected spaces being the ones that people naturally move through more easily, starting to see a whole series of relationships that then spun off of where people were and where they weren't. And in towns and cities, often it means that places like high streets are the better connected spaces, and you end up passing through them without really thinking about how or why you got there. You might be going somewhere else, but it happens to be the most convenient route. And then you start to see a whole series of spin-off kind of relationships. So if you're going to open a shop, you need footfall, you need people to walk past. And if you have the shop in the wrong place, you don't have enough footfall, and it will probably go out of business. There's other relationships happen as well. So certain types of antisocial behavior or crime, if you're climbing through somebody's window, you don't want to be interrupted by someone who happens to be walking past. And so certain types of crime happen in less well-connected spaces or with very particular spatial characteristics. So that's probably quite a long introduction about space syntax.
No, it's a really good one. What do you mean by connect? So your example, Bill Hillier's example of not being able to see people, essentially, but that also speaks about not being able to hear people. So it's like a multi-sensory lack of connections. And what space syntax does is about unpacking a whole range of connectivities, be that informational, physical, emotional, or does it, because that would get really complicated. So I'm assuming that there's boundaries to what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think it's it's interesting talking about the way that sound moves around, but it's the initial piece is thinking about what are the spaces you can see and move through. So it's not thinking about things like sound or any of those other layers. It's just to say, if I'm standing here, what can I see and what can I get to easily or less easily, essentially.
So that's at that scale, we're talking about quite small parts of the city. You know, if we're talking about pedestrians, we're talking about quite limited perspectives. But space syntax moved beyond that into much larger. So how does the model develop? So from sort of points on a graph, how does it develop
So it's using this thing called it's called a justified graph. So what that does is it starts to take every space and it will start to link it to every other space it's directly connected to. And when you're doing the graph analysis, you can measure characteristics such as how integrated you are, which is how many other spaces can you get to and how far away are they? How difficult are they to get to? Or you can measure something that's called betweenness centrality, which tells you if you're connecting everywhere to everywhere, which are the spaces which are used most often to connect everywhere to everywhere. So it's like if I wanted to speak to somebody, all of these things about your however many steps from Kevin Bacon, it's a way of kind of thinking about stuff. It started on a smaller scale. It started on things like big housing estates and new towns. And then through looking at that, they started to expand the scale that they were looking to think about whole cities. And one of the interesting bits, I think, is that the graph analysis, you can apply at different scales. So you could say, if I'm only going to move for 5 minutes or 400 meters, whatever you want your boundary to be, which are the spaces which are most useful, which are the ones that are easiest to get into in terms of the fewest turns, the ones that are easiest to see into. And you can also run the same analysis at a much bigger scale. And that's where it starts to transfer to the scale of the city. And that's what becomes really important. So if you take a city like London, you can start if you were to analyze how well connected all the streets are at the scale of the whole city, in the methodologies have developed and the technologies developed, but in the old days, which is late 80s, early kind of 90s, the comparison was that I think you were never more than something like 6 steps from Oxford Street. So Oxford Street is the space in London which is closest to everybody. And one of the really important bits of space syntax was this idea of how you measure how easy or difficult it is to get into a space. And it wasn't about using the distance, it was about using the number of turns, because the number of turns that you went through related to how visible things were and how spaces were intervisible from each other. So Oxford Street is very easy to get to from everywhere in topological terms. Other spaces are much, much more difficult. So the thing that becomes really interesting is when you start to look at how these patterns of accessibility or integration work at different scales. And you might, I think if you look at most of the kind of local high streets, a lot of them are very accessible to the wider city, and they have this overlap of being very accessible locally as well. And what that tends to mean is that you have people passing through high streets who are on their way to somewhere else. They might be moving across the whole city and they happen to go through that street because it's the best connected and it's the easiest one to follow. And those people on that street are also mixing with the people who live locally, who happen to be using that street because it's the shortcut to walk for 5 minutes to school or something like that. And what then is really interesting is the opportunities that this mixing of people allows to happen. Mm-hmm. And again, if you apply the way of kind of if you were thinking of it in, I guess, kind of commercial terms or retail terms, if you have a little local high street that's not connected to the wider city, any of those businesses can only be supported by the people who live within the distance that they can easily get to it. Mm. If you have those businesses can be supported by the local community, but there's also people from bigger area passing through, that's increasing the number of people, that's increasing the potential customers, and it's providing you with a different scale or different type of opportunity. Mm.
So the advantages of the space syntax method are that it can inform. It's not just an analytical tool, is it? It's not just a way of describing reality, but it's a way of kind of then taking that information about connections and using it to plan both the spatial plan, infrastructural plan, but also commercial planning and, development planning, perhaps.
Yeah, I'd say there's two elements to it. One is to be able to, carry out that kind of analysis to explain how things fit together. You can use the same techniques to test a future scenario. So you can drop in a master plan, you could put in the new spatial connections that you have, rerun the analysis, see what patterns of connectivity that gets you, and then think about what that means. But the bit that we haven't really talked about, it's been quite kind of technical, but the other part of it is this idea that Bill talks about, which is the idea that societies shape spatial relationships in a way that's particular to them. And that then the way that these spaces are shaped has a feedback and it impacts back on society. And so what becomes really interesting is using things like space syntax to compare cities in different parts of the world. And you tend to see really interesting things. So there are places, one of the things that you can start to do is to see in a lot of cities around the world, you will find this network of really well connected streets across the whole city. And that will tend to be the places that lots of people will mix, and that there'll be businesses and there'll be kind of commercial things happening. And the bit that becomes really interesting is what happens to the kind of the rest of the city, the background. Mm-hmm. And in some cities, that background is shaped very differently to others. And in some places, and this background tends to be the more residential, quieter places. And so you get this distinction between spaces which are clearly more public to allow you to come into contact with people that you don't already know. But those kind of background, more residential streets can be the places which are allow people to be kind of more private, or maybe follow, I don't know, maybe they're more socially private, or they're slightly different kind of spaces. And that's the interesting bit, is how that changes in cities around the world.
Yeah. And so, because I was thinking as you were talking about, say, for example, Oxford Road, where you've got this one place which is, a city of size of London, that it only has one place that has this kind of specific interconnectivity. Is that seen as being a good thing, or is the ideal for a city to have numerous places which have high levels of interconnectivity dispersed amongst places with a different form? Is that a better model? Because go on.
Yeah, so it's really interesting that I think you get lots of cities work across lots of different scales, or centers work across different scales as well.
Right.
And there's lots of stuff that kind of feeds into this, which is, or I think is quite interesting. But one is that one of the key things that space syntax can start to do is if you change the scale of analysis that you're looking at, you can start to pick up a really local center that might just be a couple of shops on a corner. You can pick up at a bigger scale whole of Oxford Street.
Yeah.
And what becomes really interesting is this way that these centers kind of merge together. And there's a couple of ideas which are maybe not challenging, but which are kind of different to how people typically think about things. And one is that centers tend to be linear, and they tend to operate along streets. They tend to be long lines rather than kind of convex blobs on a plan. And that tends to be basically because of how people move through space. And so one of the things that comes out from space syntax is that you have this centers are linear, but you also get this scale of almost continuously connected centers at different scales. And so Bill used to have a phrase that was about pervasive centrality. So there's this characteristic of centrality pervades the whole grid, and it works at different scales in different places, and you see that reflected in the type of activities that happen. The other thing I was going to talk about was when you start to think about different structures and hierarchies of centers and relationships to grids, it's really interesting if you compare, say, if you think of kind of British or European grids tend to be more organic and have developed over time. And you look at the structures that you get in those and you compare them to American cities, and American cities being very gridded. What starts to happen if you start to really study the values in the analysis, you tend to see in places like London that you will have a much more widely defined hierarchy of values. So you have something like Oxford Street. There might be 10 streets which are all very, very well connected, but the average level of connectivity might be quite low. If you look at somewhere like New York, the maximum value will be lower than the maximum value in London, but the average will be higher. Okay. And so that starts to give some really interesting ideas about your access to opportunities. Maybe in American cities might be different to UK cities because you're only ever a few steps from lots of other people. Whereas in the more organic cities, you can be much, much deeper from those things which are happening. And there's a whole load of questions in there, which is, are those grids shaped in American cities? Are they intentionally doing that? Or is that just something that has emerged and has happened? This is probably something that we might talk about later, which is this whole question about causation and correlation and linking what's actually happening to outcomes and what can you really do as planners and designers and architects.
Well, it's fascinating. You mentioned architects, so we're going to go back to your biography. You were because what you're describing, I get it, it's architecture because it's to do with the built environment, but it's not architecture as most folk understand it, and it's certainly not architecture as most students are educated in it. So how did you get to it, and what has been not only your journey, but in terms of your thought processes? Because I assume if you were an architect before, you did kind of architecture like architects do, which is not like this.
Yeah. So I am an architect, and I have got Part 3. I'm a ARB registered. So I am, as I would say, a proper architect. And there's a lot of kind of people in software who also call themselves architects, and that's definitely not architecture. That's something else again. But so I am an architect. I worked in a big practice, but I think I've always worked on quite big scale projects. So I would have previously been involved in this is early 2000, 2003, 4, was involved in kind of big regeneration master plans for town centres. And so I've always worked on quite big projects. This was BDP.
Okay.
So that was when I first started. And then after, I think I was there maybe 2-3 years, and a friend of mine sent me an advert to something that was in the AJ at the time. And because I didn't know anything about space syntax, I didn't go through the Bartlett. I wasn't aware of what space syntax was. I think it was one of the only times that the company's advertised in the AJ. One of my friends saw the advert and passed it on to me. And at that time, space syntax weren't looking for people that had the typical space syntax background, that hadn't been through the syntax course, and were looking for to go through that route. They wanted people that had a different sort of experience and had worked in practice on kind of real projects in a slightly different way. So that was in 2006, I think I started. And the first project I had was to think about how to do a city from scratch for 100,000 people. And that was really
Which
interesting.
was where?
This was in the Middle East. And I think before I started at the company, I think the company sent me a couple of books to read before I started. And I started in October, and I had a couple of weeks off in between my last job and starting. And so I did the first 2 or 3 weeks of the space syntax course at UCL just to get an introduction. And that was really, really interesting. And that was suddenly seeing a different way of thinking about things and being able to explain things, and almost kind of being aware in the back of your mind that things happen for some kind of reason, but not exactly knowing the logic behind it. And then suddenly being able to see this thing and thinking, okay, so that because of the way people move, there's this hierarchy this structure is underneath everything. You just can't see it. And that's having a huge impact on emergent effects and what happens day to day. So that was 2006. And then I've worked on, generally, I would say, big projects. We do in the company work on building scale projects. And there's a whole different set of tools for looking at patterns of visibility within buildings. So there's been some really interesting building projects I've worked on. So things like the Bloomberg headquarters in the city. And that was really interesting because their brief was, how do you design an office that creates the maximum potential for interaction between people? And so that went from the shape of the footprint, the floor plate, to where you put the lifts, to the shape of the staircase, to how people come in the morning, and how could you make it as easy as possible for people to bump into each other and then share information. And people starting to realize that the way that people speak to each other and all of this informal communication and knowledge sharing that happens generates ideas and value, and that's what's really core to lots of businesses. So I've worked on a couple of buildings, but not very many. I've really worked on big scale city projects, and that has been kind of a lot in the Middle East, looking at how cities are going to grow, some in China, Kazakhstan. I worked on some of the projects which have been most interesting are the ones which are very specific cases. So I spent probably 4 or 5 years working on unplanned settlements and slums. And these places are really interesting because if you think of what's difficult about looking at cities in Europe or the UK or the States is that they're partly the result of a planning system, and someone has intentionally put in place a certain layout. And it's always very difficult to unpick. How would a completely organically grown city work if there was nothing else shaping it? The thing that's really interesting with the unplanned settlements is that they have grown in that way. They're completely illegal. They occupy land that they're not meant to. But the thing that is really interesting is that they've grown individually. Well, often the places that people live in have been built by those people, and they've been built at the scale of a person. Yeah. They've developed over time. And one of the things that you can really see happening is that a lot of them have their own internal local spatial structures. And that all of these ideas that were coming through Bill's research about how the pattern of visibility makes certain streets more easy to get into than others, how you get more people in those streets, how you get little businesses setting up, you can see that really, really clearly in unplanned settlements and slums. And that's not to say they obviously have a number of problems. And if you look at things like the UN definition of slums, there are issues around land ownership, access to utilities, services, poor quality buildings. All of those things need to be addressed. But often you find that these areas are actually, they can be some of the most livable parts of bigger cities. They can be walkable, mixed use, really strong local communities. And there's really interesting things that I learned through looking at unplanned settlements and slums that we then applied when we were looking at, say, a project. Every now and then they come up, projects to design cities from scratch for a huge number of people. And those sorts of projects tend to be competitions, but at least you can start to apply the things that you've learned from how cities really work, and really questioning, does this slum actually have a whole load of positive characteristics compared to the rest of the city, which has been planned around the car and has been delivered at a scale and a speed that means it hasn't got the characteristics in place that make it a very livable place.
It sounds to me a little bit like, because I know a wee bit on informal settlements, and I'm actually recording a podcast episode with a chap called Kim Dovey, who's a specialist in informality in Australia, and he's written hugely about it over the years and has a huge research project on it now. So I'm kind of really interested in it. But one of the things that has always kind of struck me about it is they're essentially, we do romanticize them, and all of those things are true, and all of those negative things are also true about it. I'm sure one of the forces that's at play in informal settlements that no one really recognizes is peri-legal legislation processes through gangsterism, for example, or nepotism. But anyway, not peri-legal, illegal, or other legal perhaps. But what they strike me as being very kind of medieval, organic. And when we look at medieval Italian hill towns, or even parts of Britain that have retained certain qualities of that, we do tend to love them, and we tend to go on holiday to them and think about how marvelous they are. And space syntax's model, to me, seems to be trying to address one of the crises of modern cities, which is that they are inorganic and sort of lacking amenability to kind of those things that we used to have 500 years ago. Is that right? Is this the space syntax model designed in specific response to like rational city planning?
No, I don't think it's not a particular response to those. It's not a kind of reaction to those things. It's to understand how do the things that you're designing relate to people and to what may or may not be likely to happen. I mean,
you mean people as bodies, people as sensory beings?
Yeah.
Okay.
If you think of Barcelona is the really good example, that's a really great city. That's where I think it becomes really interesting. If you look at the way that Barcelona has the particular grid, what's really, I think Serda is really interesting if you look at the work that he did, because he spent, it was almost 10 years, wasn't it, doing the plan for Barcelona for the extension. And I think 3/4 of that was looking at the existing city and analysing it and thinking about what people did and how they did it and where it happened and what the problems were and these sorts of things. So he spent a long time learning from how it worked before doing the extension. And the thing that is really, the extension is actually really clever, because if you look at it on one level, it just looks like the repeating grid that goes on forever. But if you look really carefully, you have the kind of older Barry Gothic places like Gracia. If you look at the streets and the network of spaces in the old city and the new city, they never finish on a dead end. So what you find is that the Ramblas will link into a really important part of the new city that goes north. Passage de Gracia will link Gracia all the way down through into Barry Gothic. If you look all the way around the edge of the older kind of historic centre of Barcelona, you don't find any important streets that end on a dead end. So even though this grid looks really simple, it's been really carefully positioned so that it's really mixing between two separate systems and doing it really, really carefully. And it's not, I think there's it's almost like it's been really carefully grafted on. And I think sometimes if you look at some urban extensions or master plans, it doesn't go through the same level of care as how the two things really fit together in as many possible ways that they could.
So when I first contacted you, you sent me a link to article you'd written in AD, architectural design. Is architectural design? Yeah. That
I
is
think
it.
so.
Yeah, it is architectural design.
Yeah.
I call it AD,
Yeah.
and then you think it might be architectural digest, but no, it's architectural design. Urban futures designing the digitalized city, and you had written in a chapter in there, and there's this quote. There's this quote that I picked out from there, which is that you wrote: "The role of planners, designers, as solvers of complex spatial problems may not be to resolve a problem into a piece of architecture, but about making different use of what is already there." And there's sort of, so I wondered if you would talk about that a little bit, but also reflect on this idea that there seems to be an implication that there's almost an unarchitectural, like where question I often ask my students when we're talking about digital architecture or the digitization of architecture is like you've got to be a designer, but like where, like what's left to you as a designer. So space syntax model might seem, I suppose, to the outsider as lacking that designerly moment, and I wondered if you could talk about that.
Yeah, so I think in part of this question there's a whole kind of theme about outcomes and outputs.
Yeah.
And to explain that a bit more, there's every now and then there are certain projects you work on where lots of things you've been kind of thinking about in the back of your head all kind of resolve themselves or get to a certain point where you understand things in a particular way, or you make a step in understanding them. But there was probably, I'm not sure when it was, 5-6 years ago, we were working on one of the NHS Healthy New Towns. And they were really interesting because that was planners, transport planners and public health all working together. It had a really clear objective, which was to make a healthy new town.
Yeah.
And there was really interesting workshops where everybody would be sitting around and there would be a question about what are the outcomes going to be.
Yeah.
And planning would say, we've built 100 houses. Transport would say, we've built a mile of cycle network. And public health would say, that's not an outcome. That's the output of the development process. The outcome is that in 10 years' time, people here are happier or healthier or whatever it is. And so then that then raised a whole separate question, which is actually, do you know where people are healthy now? And do you know why they're healthy or unhealthy? And so we started to do some more work with public health. And in the last, I don't know, more than 5 years, but less than 10 years, the models that we use, the analysis that we use has become more advanced. We don't just take the spatial network now, we can link it to land use, to public transport, and we can do lots and lots of different types of analyses. One of the things we make is something called a walkability index, and it tells you if you walk through the actual street network, what's the mix of uses you can get to and how close are they? And we know that relates to mode share. But what's in parallel started to come through, and you see this coming through in the kind of mainstream press, is stories about people moving into brand new houses but being completely car dependent. These are stories that are on BBC fairly regularly. The RTPI did a report, I think, back at some point earlier this year, just looking at the amount of developments that were completely car dependent. In parallel, there's also kind of medical research that shows links between lifestyle and health outcomes, and things like the way that people get to work and the risk of obesity. And if you take public transport, the risk of obesity is reduced. If you take active transport, it's even lower. And we know that has a longer term impact, not just on the individual, but on society. And if you kind of shortcut or work your way back through that chain of things that are happening, underneath it, there's a built environment, and that makes a behavior possible or not. And that's what these people are complaining about in the stories that are making it into the mainstream press, that they live somewhere that's completely car dependent. The really important thing is that we can be really precise about explaining the characteristics of the built environment that make it car dependent or not. So then the next way of thinking it through is that if you can start to see that there's a set of spatial characteristics that affect daily activities and longer term outcomes, then the question is really about how it's almost what do you do with that spatial intelligence. And it might be that you physically resolve it into something different. It might be that you say, this area is car dependent, so we need to make a new connection so that it reduces the distance and people can walk instead of drive. Or maybe you mix the land uses to reduce the need, or you do something physical. The alternative thing is that you say, okay, we can see there's this spatial set of problems, but maybe you can't change the city itself, or maybe there isn't enough money to do it, or it's not politically viable to make a new connection or something. Then I think that's the creative bit, is in thinking, what can you do within that set of characteristics? Is it about delivering a service differently, or is it about trying to get people to share a car, so at least there's fewer cars on the road? Or do you give people, I don't know, free gym memberships? Or do you make sure that if there are elderly people in those places, that services move around to them? I think there's something really interesting, which is it might not be about always making a spatial solution to a spatial problem, but it might be a non-spatial solution to a spatial problem. It's probably mitigating it rather than solving it.
It's sort of like, that's a really fascinating possibility, because I mean, I've been thinking about this quite a lot recently in relation to education, is that our model of education is entirely focused upon them designing buildings to solve problems. It's like if you go to the doctor, expect to get a prescription, because that's the tool they've got to fix the problem. And when I was I was in Brussels day before yesterday at an inauguration of a research group on medical humanities, and this was exactly the basis of the collaboration, or the emerging collaboration, is that's what doctors do. I mean, and for many reasons, they're pressured by time, they're pressured by pharmaceutical companies, and it's our logic now. You've got an illness, here's a pill, and weirdly enough, as a patient, it's kind of what you want. And so we've got this, we've got this crisis as well, I think, a little bit in architecture, where people come to us and say, we've got a social problem, essentially, psychophysiological, cultural problem. And we go, what you need is a building. And actually what they need is like a analysis, first and foremost, this kind of Bill Hillier approach, this space.
Right. So there's I've been at a few conferences in the autumn as well. One that was really interesting, where it was about active travel, and there were behavior change consultants talking, and they talked about this model that they have of thinking about things called COM-B. And so that's an acronym. C is capability, the O is opportunity, and the M is motivation. And if you break that down, the capability is, if you're trying to get more people walking and cycling, can those people actually do that? Are they confident and competent? The motivation is why would they do it? Is there a social value that they get from it, or a financial incentive, or why would people do something? The really important bit, the architectural piece, is the opportunity, and that's the way the built environment makes something possible or not. And so I know all of these models are just different lenses to look at problems with, but it's really helpful, because you can start to think, okay, we can understand the environmental piece, we can understand if the opportunity is there or not, and then it might be thinking about, okay, is it about improving people's confidence to walk or cycle, or is it something else, or is it about motivation? There's a really interesting, I know the NHS was looking at lots of things around social prescribing, exercise as treatment, and all of these things, and working on a different project with public health. One of the things that people were talking about was behavior change campaigns, that when they work really effectively if the doctor tells you to do something differently. If the doctor tells you that you need to do this, it's probably because something serious is going to happen, and you need to do something to stop that from happening. And I think that's something. There's a really interesting link to health. The thing where it links into kind of education, I think that's interesting, is talking to public health workers and practitioners. They have a really good understanding of data, what data shows, when to trust it, and this understanding that data is never 100% perfect. It will be a snapshot in time. There might be some characteristics that are missing from it, but it's something that helps you kind of home in on something and understand. It's not why something's happening, but it's telling you what's happening, kind of where and kind of when.
So Go on, sorry, carry on.
Yeah, so I think there's something in here which is about what are you see data and analysis being used much more across a whole wide set of things which you didn't see 10 or 15 years ago. And you think of even just simple things like infographics and the way that data gets presented, and there's really nice data visualizations.
Yeah.
And I think there's a really key piece which is just around being really critically able to think about data and to position it. What kind of data is it? Is it something that's about outcomes and daily activities, or is it data about the systems that you can actually control as a designer? And then looking at the data itself, does it really represent what you think it does? Does it represent the individual house or the individual street, or has something been, is it very difficult to collect data at that level? And so things have been grouped up into a bigger area. Does that area make sense or not? Does it actually map onto the urban grain underneath it in a logical way, or is it just a completely abstract representation?
Yeah.
So there's a whole load of critical thinking around kind of, I guess it's data literacy, really.
It's quite interesting, like the idea that if you want people to do something good for their health, the doctor has to say it. It's like they're trusted, which gives them an enormous amount of power, and it's not always been used for the good. Architects have, I don't know, maybe what space syntax does is it provides architects who have lost some of their claims to authority, their professional claim. I mean, it's part of a wider crisis of authority in our culture. But maybe what space syntax's model does is it provides this robust body of evidence that people can go, it's okay, he's not just telling us his modernist vision. He's not just Le Corbusiering this situation and giving us, and it's unfair to Le Corbusier, but just giving us his grand projet. This is solid stuff.
Yeah, right. I think it's building up that evidence base, isn't it, to be able to look at things objectively and consistently and quantitatively to some extent. The other bit that's really interesting is the thing about the doctor and doctors taking a Hippocratic oath.
Yeah.
I don't know if you saw, there was probably, this is before COVID. I was going to say recently, it was before COVID, but there was a movement for data scientists to have a Hippocratic oath, and that was about the way that data was going to be used and shared and all of these sorts of things, and only to be used for kind of positive social impact and those kind of questions, which is interesting because people are starting to realize how important it is and how many other decisions it goes on to influence.
I mean, for sure. It's kind of starting to define the architecture of our everyday lives, like literally. But it has this kind of potentially democratic quality about it, insofar as it's produced or it's facilitated by these little devices, potentially that we carry in our pockets, and if not, a desktop computer or a laptop. So it kind of enables a co-development by citizens of this data. It's architectural analysis that is being taken out of the hands of an exclusive minority and potentially democratized into the general public. I mean, is that the idea with space syntax? I'm assuming Bill Hillier's work starts around the same time as a lot of architectural critique of modernism starts happening, where Jan van Eyck and the participatory movement and the citizen-led movement and the Jane Jacobs kind of movements, where you've got a genuine sense that modernist project is not serving the well-being of the community, and it's not serving the cultural forms of the community. And so, is space syntax's model directly intended as a mechanism for a sort of data-driven democratization of urban environments and architectural environments, or does it just so happen to do that?
Well, I think one of the reasons the company actually spun out from university, this is more than 30 years ago, was that the group was doing a lot of work with community groups, and they were testing things, finding that they weren't working how people wanted them to or expected them to. And I think after a developer had a scheme turned down, the next time the developer had a project, he came to the company to say, last time we designed it this way, you showed that it wasn't going to work the way that we expected, and that was one of the reasons it didn't get approved. And then he said, so this time I want you to help me make it work. And so it was somebody recognizing that if you're trying to get things approved and to try to you need to actually, it's more than just saying that something's going to happen. You need to be able to prove that what you're saying is going to really happen, is going to actually happen in real life. And so it was, yeah.
And does Space Syntax do sort of post-occupancy evaluation to see whether reality measures up? So you sent me through a nice short video, which I'll link to in the podcast description, of the city in Kazakhstan, Al-Nazur, isn't it?
It's changed it's Astana now.
Astana.
It changed its name a few times in the last couple of years or so.
Well, Astana, we shall go with Astana for the moment. Yeah, I was just wondering, when you do a project, do you spend time in the aftermath actually, POEing it?
So we normally do. So there's a kind of consistent methodology, which is to carry out the analysis of the existing place, make your model, look at your data, and often to validate the model, we'll do a survey at that point in time at the beginning. So it might be on certain projects, we might do a survey to count people on streets and make sure that the model's actually predicting where people are walking at the moment. And if you validate your existing model against what's actually happening, then you can say, okay, it's at that point in the design process, you can't go forward in time and count something, but you can model it. And so we validate it against existing condition, adapt that model to match a design, and then use that to forecast it. There's a handful of projects where we've been able to do it. There are what tends to be really difficult is often clients, once something is built, that's it, it's built and it's finished. And to try to get the time to go back later to check it's working how you said it was going to work is really, really difficult. I think we've done it on a few really big projects, but often I was talking to somebody else at an event the other day, and they were a lift supplier, and what they were talking about, the way they've adapted their technology, and they now go through this process where they say, okay, we set everything up for you, you open the building, then we're going to spend 6 months tuning it for you. We'll look at when people are arriving, we'll look at how we can tweak things and get things to respond. And they were saying how it seems kind of crazy that people are prepared to spend so much money on this thing, but nobody's interested in looking at it once it's built, checking that it's really doing the thing that it's meant to do, making any kind of final adjustments or tuning it to how it's being used day to day. People are not so interested in, and it's a really, I think it kind of goes back to that thinking about outputs and outcomes and being able to really question why have you done this? Why have you built this building? If you're then not going to keep improving it and keep tweaking it to allow a better kind of result to happen. So that's kind of a long way of saying we've done some post-occupancy studies, but there's a lot of places it's really difficult to do because it's just not on people's radar to think about.
Yeah. It's another quote from your essay where you write, the right design cannot guarantee, and this pertains to what we've been talking about, cannot guarantee positive outcomes. It can at least make them possible. And this, like, again, this idea of an organic architecture as a kind of architecture more as an infrastructure which supports everyday life rather than the delineation of absolute modes of behavior and usage. And perhaps this then also touches back on that point you made at the beginning, which is about the American grid city. Like, why does it work so well? Why does New York work so well? Is it to do with this generation of a framework? I mean, God knows how they did it. I guess intelligence or something. Yeah, so I just wondered if you could unpack that a little bit.
Yeah. So I think probably what it comes to is this, is thinking about, I guess, kind of complexity. And a lot of the times, a really kind of good example of a complex system where it becomes biological is things like ecosystems that people are now really aware of, and how there's a whole sequence of interconnected conditions and actors. And if you start to think about cities as being complex systems, there's the built environment, but that's only one of a number of different things. I mean, health is a really good example of an outcome, and how it's really horrible because it's so complex, but it's a really good example. If you look at health outcomes, there's a really nice systems map that was put together by the Government Office for Science probably about 10 years ago, and it's a systems map of everything that's contributing to obesity as an outcome. And it's one of these diagrams with lots and lots of different bubbles, arrows going between the bubbles and feeding back, making these feedback loops. And at the center of the diagram, it talks about a calorie imbalance. So that's the thing. You have too many calories, you don't burn them off, you become overweight, and these sorts of things. What they've done is categorize all of the bubbles. And so some of the bubbles are to do with socioeconomic characteristics, what your income is, what food you can afford. Some of it is about demography. Some of it is about what conditions you may inherit from your parents. Some of it is about the lifestyle you lead. But a part of it is the built environment. And so because you've got all of these different elements that are all interacting at the same time to affect the outcome, you could design the perfect built environment that is really walkable, but they still might not walk. They might not walk to work. They might not walk to school. They might sit around and just play PlayStation or Xbox or something and have a terrible diet, and they're going to be obese, however you design the environment. And so I think it might sound a bit negative to say that you can't guarantee a positive outcome, but what you can do is make sure that the conditions are in place for that positive outcome to happen. And there's also, you can do the opposite. You can make it almost impossible for people to walk to work. And that's this point that I mentioned earlier on about the stories that you see coming through in the mainstream press. That's a kind of a symptom of that happening, is that you've designed out the potential for people to do that activity. So really it's about, you can't guarantee something will definitely happen, but you can make it possible. And I think it's about understanding the position of the environment, the built environment, and the spatial relationships you create within that bigger, more complex picture. And I think the thing with New York, I guess the question is, what's the aspect that has been successful? Is it that it's attracted huge amounts of capital to grow the way it has? And that would probably not just be the way that the street grid's been defined, and that the blocks in between the streets have been separated into plots that have just happened to be, probably hasn't just happened. They've been the optimum size to be able to sell individual plots for people to build, that you can easily combine them together. At the same time as that, they've had things like the zoning rules have changed at different times, so you can build more height in different places. There's probably been other kind of financial and economic conditions as well in the background, and so it's this whole big picture of how everything is overlapping at the same time. I think that's the other point I think that I mentioned in that essay, is something about being aware of those other systems that are in place at the same time. And that's what it's really trying to get to, is to say there might be wider economic or political conditions that mean something is possible at a certain point in time, or it might not be.
This kind of complexity that you're talking about is something that, judging by what you've said, space syntax is starting to deal with more and more. And space syntax's design model is intimately tied to technology. And as technology emerges, and this is just as I read it, so feel free to correct me, but as technology develops, improves, advances in various ways, space syntax can deal with greater and greater complexity through advances in coding. And I just think I find that kind of idea really intriguing, that there is this other architecture which isn't addressing technology. In the design studio, for example, here, computer technology is simply an advance on pen and paper. It's just another way of doing pen and paper. The same design process is actually occurring. But space syntax, with its it's a symbiosis between technology and design, human design activity. It's a totally different idea, isn't it?
So I don't know if you've heard this idea about there was I can't remember the person who put it together, but it came from some technology. I think it was from a technology website. There's this process of digitalization. Sorry, I'm going to get it in completely the wrong order. Digitization, and then digital transformation.
Yeah.
And digitization is this idea that you're just taking existing data and you're making it digital. Digitalization is then the tools to work with that data. And if you look at typically, I think a lot of things that are happening is that we're kind of in the stage of digitalization.
Yeah.
So we've got the tools, but they're doing very similar things to, it's just that you're using a mouse to click on points instead of a pen or a pencil and a piece of paper. The really interesting bit, I think, is the digital transformation. And that's the fundamental change of how you can rethink things in a different way and how there can be a completely different focus on what's actually happening. And I think it would be really good to be able to say we're kind of on the cusp, I hope, of being able to do that kind of transformation.
And again, that leads to this kind of potential diffusion. It's sort of like Web 2.3.0, I suppose, isn't it? It's like the potential for citizen engagement in the processes of not only the production, but so if space syntax don't get employed to go into cities like Astana that they've developed, but the citizens could cooperate in that, in the post-occupancy phase, that would be, or in any planning. I mean, because planning is a subject that I come across time and time over in this podcast, people's frustrations with planning and the need to reform planning. If planning could be transformed by modes of coding that are characteristic of your model, of space syntax's model, it'd be potentially wonderful.
Yeah, I think there's some really big questions in there about what it is you're coding. Is it about the way that buildings look, the materials and proportions, or is it about the actual underlying spatial characteristics? I think there's and I would say that it's really important, the underlying spatial characteristics, because that's the thing which is so influential to what happens day to day. I think the other bit that's really interesting is thinking about I can use Astana as an example, but what we started to do was to say, okay, so we've got now tools that mean we can better explain how to put in place the built environment that enables certain outcomes. The really important question is, what do you want those outcomes to be? And then the question is actually, who sets those outcomes? Should it be best practice, international best practice? And why do we in London know anything better than somebody who lives in Astana about what the outcome should be? There's something about local policy, and there's about the people who live there as well. And I think what we did in Astana was we ran through this kind of process in a really simple way. You could say, why do you want to change the city? Which means you have to ask what you want it to be like. Then you can start to say, okay, if we know what we want it to be like, what do we know about the conditions that enable these outcomes to happen? Then you can start to analyze the city, see where the conditions are in place, see where you need to change it. That can effectively become your master plan that you can then test and make sure it's doing things the right way. But the way that we got into the question around what the outcomes should be was by talking to stakeholders in the city. And that included people in city departments, included people like the mayor, but it also included residents and people who lived there. And often those are the people who are most invested in the city, people who've got houses there or raising families, and they'll probably be there longer than the kind of cycles of different local politicians or people who happen to be working in the city. So I think there's a really interesting point, which is about engaging with people and engaging with them at the right time. And I think one of the issues around consultation that you see often is that you're asking people what they think about a scheme that's already been developed, which is really difficult to have any say on, have any change on or impact on, and which will be described in a particular way. And I think there's questions about, should you have do you need experts? This was the big Brexit question. I think you really do need experts, but it's using experts in the right way, and it's to be able to trust them and to show why you should trust them. And I think I think the process would be great if you got people involved really early on to say, what should it be like?
Mm-hmm.
What do you want it to be like to live here now? Oh, sorry, in 10 years' time.
Mm-hmm.
And as you're developing ideas, to keep playing them back and to be able to use technology to say, well, look, we know if you want somewhere to be livable, you have to be able to walk to one of these things, and we can show you if we have this option, more people can walk to more of these things, and so it's better than option B because of here's the reason why. And I think it's to get those big objectives, to get buy-in early on, and to keep taking people through the process, so that when you get to the point of saying, what do you think, everybody is bought in from the beginning and has seen things develop and has had a chance to shape it.
How do we, given that this is coming, you know what I mean? This is sort of an inevitability. This data-driven stuff. It's as you say, we're on the cusp of it. How do we get students thinking about it? Like, what, I suppose, what in your education prepared you for it, but what would, if you were to start again, what would you want to know so that you could attack this with verve and vigor? Or is it, do you think, that rather obtuse educational system in designing pretty objects that we do with architecture students, is that the right way of starting? And then, or could we do better?
So I think there was something really interesting, which was when I started, we've got at Space Syntax, we have people with lots of different professional backgrounds. Some people come from design and planning, some people have an economics background, some people come from geography. So there's lots of people with different ways of thinking about things. And when I started, when I was working in conventional practice or in normal kind of everyday practice, I think there was a difference between the kind of things that you do at the end of university and what you did as a day-to-day job. And I mean, you have a lot of freedom at university and you're doing interesting things and you can do kind of cutting edge things. And that might be different to what a real client wants on their, when they're paying for making a huge investment in a big project. They probably don't want to do something crazy and risky. And so I kind of questioned what I had really learned at university at that point. But I think one of the things that was really interesting was then starting a different job with people from different backgrounds and seeing how people who were really, really clever would really struggle to think about how to start to resolve something. And I think this is where some of the thinking came from around this spatial problem solving. And I think what you really learn through architecture school is being able to think about some of these complicated and complex interactions between things and how you start to resolve them. I think one of the things that Space Syntax does is it makes it really explicit how you start to resolve those, and that there might be a hierarchy to the things that you consider in the order that you consider them. And I remember again having to sketch design something for a big project from scratch in the middle of nowhere that ended up nothing happened with it. But it was as an architect, it was reasonably easy to start with something, sketch something. If it doesn't work, sketch it again, keep trying it and changing it and tweaking it and adjusting it and keep revising it. And somebody with say a geography background might have done lots and lots of thinking through about processes that need to happen and why things are formed in a certain way. But to begin to actually resolve some of those problems or those questions, it was really interesting that the person I was working with was really struggling to do some of those things. And so I think in some ways, I think this is why I think it's about solving problems, and in some ways it's maybe not being worried at the very beginning about doing the wrong thing or making a mistake, because
this phrase that you use of trial and error urbanism.
So yeah, so that's kind of interesting, because I think I know the thing I'm saying now is that architects or designers are not scared of putting something on paper as a way to start and to keep tweaking it and changing it. What I think becomes really interesting was when we got the work in Astana, we won that through a design competition, and we won it by almost kind of simulating the growth of a city, which means you have to work out what are the systems that you design. And we were boiling it down from looking at places like unplanned settlements and really, really clever, complicated cities that people had thought of as essentially big buildings that had ended up being very difficult to deliver in real life. We got to the point of saying you need to design the fewest number of the most important elements. And that was the spatial network, so the network of streets and pedestrian routes, the urban blocks, and you need to subdivide those blocks into plots. And based on the way that your network that you've designed works, you can allocate densities and typologies and land use mixes based on what happens in cities and cities that lead to certain outcomes. So at the end of it, you end up with, on one hand, it's quite a simple master plan because it's just defining plots and it's giving typologies to each plot and it's giving you center lines. And the question is, how is that different to the commissioner's plan of Manhattan or Serda's grid? And I think there's a really interesting comparison, which was, I mean, when we made it, we analyzed cities. We then scripted something to grow a city, bringing into it these characteristics from cities that we could see that work well in other places. And the thing I was saying a long time ago now about this kind of foreground network of very well connected streets and a background network which is a bit quieter and less well connected. And I mean, there's a really interesting parallel that I saw a quote that was from a motor racing team where they were talking about in the 80s, they used to just design something, try it, see if it made a car quicker. If it worked, then that was great. If it didn't, then they had to start again. And it was talking about how they'd adopted all of these processes around CFD and computer modeling and simulation. And that meant that they would only make the things that they knew really worked. And they were saying the old approach was trial and error. And now we've got something which is about, it's much more intelligent and it leads to much better outcomes. And I think if you look back, this is probably tying into this digital transformation idea as well. It means that you can start to kind of move away from trial and error urbanism. So it means that you can stop building a housing estate in the middle of nowhere and then discovering that people are car dependent once they start living there. And you can start to use the spatial intelligence before that to avoid certain locations or to try to mitigate something. So I think that's the kind of the counter, I think. So I think looping it back to this point about education, I think to be able to think things through and not be afraid to start with something and to test that thing, it's the process of testing it before you get to actually completing it that becomes really important, I think.
Brilliant. I think that's a perfect point to stop on. Thank you very, very much, Ed. I've really enjoyed speaking with you.
Thank you. You too.
Fascinating, challenging, and lit. Thank you to Ed for taking the time to speak with me and for guiding the discussion. Please see the podcast description for details of space syntax and a link to a short BBC Tomorrow's Worlds video from 1993 featuring Bill Hillier using space syntax to analyse the North Peckham estate. Of course, there's links also to Ed's social, professional profile. And there's so much online about space syntax, so have a dig around. And if you like this, subscribe and share the episode. Thanks for listening.